Welcome everyone to CG seminar number 196, and today we are tackling corruption in the university. Quite a spectacular heading, isn't it? Fraud prevention, market making, and the big four. That's the big four accounting firms, and we've got Cris Shaw to talk us through that topic. Before I introduce Cris, let me take you through the webinar protocols. Webinar is being recorded and will be posted online on the CG website within the next 48 hours or so. And a transcript of the chat function conversation will also be posted, and you of course can access the webinar once it's been posted on YouTube. Now, please keep yourself muted unless you have been asked to speak or you're about to ask your question. We suggest also that you turn off your video during the webinar, but please turn it on when you are going to ask a question during the Q&A part of the session. We recommend using speaker view in Zoom so you can more clearly see who is talking. Now, to ask a question of Cris, use the chat function. Type your question out, and we will select the Q&A participants on the basis of what's coming through in the chat. We obviously would like you to keep your questions related to the topic and the presentation, and we'll generally compose the questions according to their relevance and to ensure we have a range of participants from different places. But let me strongly recommend to you that you come in early with your question, because we're getting very good Q&A propositions right at the end of webinars, and we're unable to bring them into the speaking list. So if you put your question or your statement forward towards the end of Chris's presentation or just after that, you're going to get into the Q&A. Leaving it later runs a bit of a risk. When you're invited to ask your question, please unmute yourself, switch on your video, and then state your name, where you are from, and then tell us what you want to tell us. Well, it's now a pleasure to introduce Cris Shaw. Now, Cris is a professor of anthropology at Goldsmiths in London. Goldsmiths part of University of London, and Goldsmiths is the institution which educated my daughter at first degree level, so a name very welcome in the Marginson family. Prior to 2019, he was professor of anthropology and the founding director of the Europe Institute at Auckland University in New Zealand. New Zealand's arguably New Zealand's premier university for research. His research addresses key issues in political and legal anthropology, including European integration, audit culture, university reform, policy mobilities, and the ethnography of organizations and corruption. He is the author and editor of numerous books, including Building Europe, The Cultural Politics of European Integration, Policy Worlds with Susan Wright, and Death of the Public University, also with Susan Wright, 2017. So, Cris, we look forward very much to your presentation today. The screen is now yours.
Oh, well, thank you, Simon, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for coming. Yeah, I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'll put it on the large view. So I should probably begin with a kind of a bit of a disclaimer or a caveat. The paper isn't exactly about corruption in the university, although it is based on an article that I wrote in Current Anthropology, and it does address that theme in a bit more detail. I do have a long-standing interest in corruption, and I once did an edited book about this, about the anthropology of corruption. But I have to confess, corruption isn't something that can be easily studied ethnographically. Just, you know, we like to be there when we're doing kind of field work, but it's not easy to be in the right location. I know that Philip Albach wrote a few years ago, quote, "No one has developed a worldwide academic corruption index." I should probably add to that, yet, not yet. I better not make that suggestion to the Office for Students or Gavin Williamson. They might think it's a good idea. So rather what I want to focus on instead is the performativity of corruption and anti-corruption narratives. And I'm coming at this from all sorts of directions. Yes, performance and performativity theory from the likes of Judith Butler, but also to see these narratives as speech acts, you know, in the tradition of Austin, which bring about particular kinds of social reality and create certain kinds of subjectivity. I'm a huge fan of Ian Hacking, making up people, and I like his concept of dynamic nominalism, how, you know, we create the categories and entities through language. And I think anti-corruption and corruption, it could be framed in that theoretical bracket. So my broader interest, though, is in studying the effects of the increasing commercialization and institutionalized anti-fraud initiatives taking place in universities and elsewhere. And corruption, in this respect, is a bit like witchcraft accusations, in the sense that, you know, they highlight certain important cleavages and tensions, or to Bowderize Levi-Strauss, corruption is good to think with. And it's also, as I'm going to point out in this paper, it's also a very convenient source of revenue and income for some people. There is a kind of wider question that I'll just sort of deal with this straight away. Have universities become more prone to corruption in recent years, over the past decade? And certainly they have become more risk averse. Now, why is that? Well, obvious reasons, really. I think the rise of kind of neoliberal policy programs, new public management, it is very much linked to, Simon, what you many years ago framed as the enterprise university model, what Slaughter and Leslie have termed academic capitalism. But I mean, all of these factors have produced both new opportunities, new tensions and cleavages. And I think more importantly, these changes also reflect the rise of audit culture and the growing use of accountancy logics and practices in the governance and management of our universities. So in a way, you know, there's much discourse around decolonizing the university. This is an example of the recolonization of higher education by the logics and practices of financial accountancy and financial interests. And significantly, yeah, there were two reports published about 6 years ago, one by UNESCO and one by Transparency International, and both of them, you know, argued that corruption in higher education has become a matter of mounting international concern for governments. But let's park that for one side. My paper is really framed around one anecdote, and well, it's more than an anecdote. It's a personal story, and let me narrate it to you as the story, as I experienced it. So one day I came into work. I'm not going to try to anonymize my the place of work where this study is based. It was New Zealand's premier research-led university, or self-defined, the largest university in New Zealand, Auckland. And I opened up my pigeonhole box and I found this cardboard, well, this cardboard thing in front that you see here in the slide. And when you put it together, it creates a pyramid, and it's supposed to be like a little desk pyramid. And it was announcing 3 new initiatives, major policy initiatives at the university. One was the university was becoming a smoke-free environment, and the other one was our conservation, energy saving policy about, you know, not wasting electricity and sparing paper. But the third one, right in the middle here, really caught my eye. It says, good call. Let me read it to you. It's probably too small to see. Let's protect our university, it says. And it's full of imperatives and injunctions, and announcing a new fraud and anti-corruption initiative. And it asserts that as staff of the University of Auckland, we are committed to protecting the reputation of our university. If you suspect a staff member of defrauding the university or is engaging in unethical behaviour, please make a good call. Contact KPMG Fair Call on 0800 100 526. Our independent experts will provide you with support. Well, And this obviously, as an anthropologist who has spent about 15 years when I moved to New Zealand studying the New Zealand higher education system, and I'm really interested in the transformation of universities in the so-called knowledge economy. This really piqued my interest. Why? You know, what was going on here? Why had my university introduced this initiative? So I decided to investigate further, and tracking through the archives, what I learned, I found that a series of Radio New Zealand Newswire press releases dating back to the early 2010 period, announcing that fraud in New Zealand had reached record levels, as this slide shows you. This is one of the news wires, and warning that worse was yet to come. KPMG then published in 2010 a fraud and misconduct survey warning that the threat was as much internal as external. And it said that under the heading, "Who did it and why?" it's announced, and I quote, 65% of major frauds are committed by people already working in the victim organization, who usually act alone. Well, yeah, there's more of these embargoed initiative announcements. There's a whole string of them going through. So the following year, almost as if, you know, corroborating this dire warning and prediction, KPMG started to produce a 6-monthly fraud barometer. It was based on reported fraud cases that had been brought before the criminal courts. But KPM's forensic accountancy expert warned that these figures were, quote, only the tip of the iceberg. The lobby group, Business New Zealand, echoed these warnings, and I quote, it says 98% by value of these frauds were inside jobs. The other key take-home message, of course, was that most companies and organizations were way too complacent and did not spend enough on fraud and corruption prevention or detection. Well, it wasn't that long before I noticed that other audit and accountancy firms were moving in on the act. And in 2013, Deloitte, another one of the big four, commissioned its own bribery and corruption in Australia and New Zealand survey. Menacingly titled, look at this is the picture on the right, menacingly titled A Storm on the Horizon. And in 2014, PricewaterhouseCoopers published its Global Economic Crime Report, subtitles, What You Don't See Can Hurt You. And this included a 32-page New Zealand supplement. Well, this message of warning was echoed by New Zealand's Serious Fraud Office. And it would be easy to sit back and say that New Zealand is the country perceived to have the least corruption, and it's true, you know, along with kind of Norway and Denmark and Sweden and Finland. New Zealand is always in the top 5, according to Transparency International rankings, of the least corrupt country. So they take seriously the reputational damage this causes. And it says, and that it only happened to others. However, we are seeing more instances of domestic corruption, such as bribes paid to public officials and corrupt payments made within the private sector. Organizations need to be awake to the changing environment, and so on. So, you know, the message, and it goes back to this theme about the performativity of corruption narratives. Here, what you see is very much, it seems like the cultivation of a climate of risk and anxiety, which then provides a space in which the big four can expand into new markets. We've also got the rise, of course, of the anti-corruption industry, and it's also linked to, I mean, I'm a great fan of the anthropologist based in Sweden, Stephen Sampson, who talks about the rise of moral capitalism, and he's written quite extensively about how companies now have invested hugely in ethics as a key asset for and of their companies. So this is kind of an example of moral capitalism. So what about the genealogy of this anti-fraud hotline? What I learned, well, what I learned in my investigations is that this whistleblowers hotline was seen very much as a response to the New Zealand Auditor General's fraud prevention guidelines, but it was also, you know, pretty much, I was told it was pretty much a standard part of the university's overall fraud prevention program, which was overseen by the university's council and particularly its audit and risk committee. The fact that it was outsourced to a private company based in Sydney, New Zealand, was to ensure both confidentiality and proper independence. So, yeah, and the intranet, you know, the web page says that the hotline, I think that it's too small to read there. The hotline has generated about 10 calls per annum. Each one is investigated, and it was, you know, the university was pleased to report back in 2013-14 that no incidences or evidence of fraud have been detected. But I was kind of interested in more than this. And I really wanted to probe this a bit more deeply to ask, you know, what have staff experiences been with this hotline? And so as a member of my tertiary education union executive, I asked my colleagues if it would be okay with them if I use the staff union email list to contact TEU members to ask them about their experience with the hotline. As I say, I wanted to know how members were using it, what their experience of it was, just to do a bit more empirical research on this. So I sent out an email, probably I didn't get around to it till about 8 o'clock, 8:30 at night on a sort of Tuesday evening. 12 hours later, I receive an email from the University of Auckland's Research Ethics Processes Team Leader. I didn't even know that role existed, informing me that, and I quote, "A staff member forwarded your email to the chair of the university's Human Participants Ethics Committee to ask whether my research had UAHPEC approval." I was politely informed that formal ethics approval was required if I wished to solicit information of this kind. I should just add that the process for getting ethics approval at the University of Auckland takes months, and most of the forms are about 40 pages long and they're vetted. So I hadn't, but that evening I received a telephone call from a colleague who warned me. He basically said, "Cris, if I were you, I would issue a retraction of your email." He said, "I know that, you know, you might have laid yourself open and very vulnerable to disciplinary action." He said, "Take it from me, I've had firsthand experience of this." So I did. I sent out an email telling all my colleagues, please ignore my previous email, as I don't yet have University of Auckland's Human Ethics Participant Committee approval for it. That actually had a positive effect, because I got an avalanche of emails from sympathetic members saying, right, let me contact you informally and I'd be happy to brief you about my own experience off the record. And then curiously, I was later contacted by a member of the senior management team who offered to help me and to put me in touch both with the university's team dealing with this and with the KPMG Australia experts who were managing and running the hotline. I'm not sure why. I mean, and I was very grateful to her for doing this. So I did, and I was able to carry out interviews with the New Zealand team and with the experts in Australia who put together this package. What did I learn? Well, often the empirical research findings were pretty prosaic. Yeah, there were about 10 calls per year. Virtually none of them had anything to do with fraud. Virtually all of them had something to do with bullying and harassment, which I attribute to the fact that we used to have a dedicated independent person at the university to handle that. And the university vice chancellor, in his wisdom, decided that to scrap the office and relocate the fraud, the bullying and harassment policy as a branch of HR. And so people felt rather reluctant and loath to go to HR to complain about bullying in the university. So they were using it for this, which was really not the purpose for which it was designed. But going back, rowing back then, why the big four? Well, one of the interesting things about the big four, particularly PricewaterhouseCoopers and KPMG, is that they often, their image of themselves and the way that they represent themselves is that, we are agents of anti-corruption. We are warriors of integrity, and the part of our, the public aspect of our mission is to combat fraud and so on. And well, the irony is, and I've been researching this elsewhere, is that all of the big four have very long histories and quite well documented histories of audit failure and quite large scale accountancy, corruption and incompetence. And KPMG is a particularly egregious case, the case of the Hollinger scandal. Every country where these companies operate have got some quite major examples that you can easily find. The last year, I think the Financial Times did a whole series of investigative reports about the market failure, the crisis in auditing and the culpability of the big four, who've also been very complicit in sort of developing tax avoidance packages. And this is a longer story. Sue Wright and I have written a bit about this, about how the big four got big and the kind of bifurcation in their remit from being inspecting books and bookkeeping and auditing. Now, by far and away, the largest source of their revenue comes from consultancy, and they're offering themselves up as sort of one-stop sites for all kinds of management, restructuring advice, consultancy, HR, and now anti-fraud, anti-corruption actions. I'm going to reach the end of this fairly quickly then, but so the conclusions I draw from this is that one of the problems that we have, of course, is that why going to the big four is that there are the financial logics and conflicts of interest that are at play in the activities of the big four accountancy firms. In some ways, makes them rather compromised actors, certainly not warriors of integrity, and not necessarily that independent. The key point here is that, I think this is a short and small case study, but it shows us how these firms collude in the very risk and corruption fears that they claim to ameliorate. And it's a process that is really illustrative of the market-making potential of anti-corruptionism discourses. The audit firms produce the reports highlighting the dangers of fraud, and for which, of course, they then profess to offer the best solution to their fee-paying clients, and they get on side the business community, and they, their warnings are that every organizations are being woefully complacent. As Stephen Sampson says, he said, this anti-corruption industry is both a growing transnational business and a world in the anthropological sense. And it illustrates how commercial interests are really kind of capturing the assets of the public university. And I suppose that it's probably not a good form to conclude with a question, but to what extent does this represent a kind of a new phase of academic capitalism and the progressive unbundling of the public university? And as a kind of a final kind of coda, for me, it begged the question, why did the University of Auckland's Audit and Finance Committee appoint KPMG Australia, rather than, say, seeking to deal with this problem in-house or with professionals not tied to the management and accountancy industry? They could have gone to Transparency International's long-standing advocacy and legal advice centres, for example. Might it have had something to do with the composition of that committee? The fact that the chairman of the university's council was himself an accountant, or that the university's internal control environment is regularly audited by its internal auditors PricewaterhouseCoopers, at least PwC were not invited to run the hotline. And coincidentally, one of the council members had been a partner for KPMG for 30 years and chair and chief executive of KPMG New Zealand from 2008 to 2011. This is the very moment, the very years in which this initiative was launched. And finally, just returning to the point that I began this talk with about the way in which, privatization and commercialization are changing the meaning and the mission of the public university. Paradoxically, the institutionalization of anti-fraud programs, it could be argued, is actually fueling that process. And there are all sorts of reasons why the financialization of the university increases the opportunity spaces and the risk of corruption and fraud. So perhaps we should worry less about corruption in the university than corruption of the university, or particularly as that relates to the increasing capture of its assets by predatory financial interests and for-profit companies. And I'll end there because hopefully that will have segued into lots more kind of questions.
Well, thanks, Cris. Yes, and that's exactly what's happening. People are now coming into the chat and signifying that they'd like to speak to you. I'm going to ask you a question first, and then we'll go to Enzo Remo. My question is what do these large corporate universities do in relation to the Big Four? Can they disentangle themselves from all meaningful connections? I mean, one of the problems is that the decentralized parts of the university have their own deals and relationships to some extent. Not everything's orchestrated from the center. Sometimes large medical faculties run their own race and so on. But can the universities reduce their exposure to the dangers which you point to, this sort of double-sided relationship with the Big Four, by commissioning other lesser companies to engage with in the audit and other functions that the Big Four carry out? Certainly they could, you would think, de-emphasize their use of expensive business services that don't add terribly much value, often lack contextualized knowledge, and are often better done in-house or by cheaper people with more commitment. But can they completely disentangle themselves from this world of fraud anxiety by perpetuated by fraudsters themselves?
Thanks, Simon. I mean, that's a really good and important question, and it's not just universities, but I think we've reached the point now where the what do you call a four-way monopoly, duopoly, or quadropoly?
Quad monopoly or something, yeah.
The problem we've got, and this is a real problem, the UK government is hotly debating this about whether we've reached the point where we need some kind of antitrust laws, and we need to, it's seriously being mooted whether we should break up the Big Four. Certainly separating their audit from their kind of management consultancy and advisory roles is highly recommended. When you put this to the Big Four sort of spokespersons themselves, they always say, oh no, we're expert and professional and great at keeping a wall between that, so there's no conflict of interest. Of course there is. The problem we've got is that these companies have become so indispensable to the accountancy industry that it seems almost inconceivable, that they are the benchmark of professionalism. Apparently so, although when you in accounting of large companies, the University of Auckland is one of the largest employers in Auckland, if not New Zealand. I mean, it's got 5,000 employees. It's over $1 billion operation, and I don't think it's simply too large and too complex for smaller accountancy firms to get to be viable. This is how it's perceived and narrated anyway, that nobody else really makes the grade. And when you look at the FTSE 100, we've now reached the point where I think 99% of all listed companies on the FTSE 100 are audited by the Big Four. And you go down the other scale, they dominate, and it really is a problem. And I think it represents a growing threat, because, you know, never mind organizations being complacent about fraud and corruption, I think the evidence shows that the big four are rather complacent about their own record of market failure, which in the case of KPMG in America was, I think, about 30% of all the audits it did were deemed to be failed or not appropriate. There's some really quite high statistic. I don't have them to hand, but yeah, they really do need to get their act together.
Thanks, Cris. Yes, it's so there's no way out, not no easy way out anyway. Enzo Ramo, please come in, and good to have you back.
No, thank you. Thanks very much. I really enjoyed that presentation. I guess what I wanted to do was get at this from a slightly different angle, and you know, and the question that I have is do you think corruption by university staff, as opposed to what you were getting at of the university, a risk at all? I mean, the University of Auckland thing that you shared suggests that corruption is something which staff engage in for themselves. And I spent 30 years in universities, latterly as a PwC, and I'm not sure I've seen much evidence of this at all. But isn't the bigger risk, and pointed to in the Transparency International guidance for charities and for universities, undertaken often by junior staff unknowingly because they haven't been properly trained or supported for the university, in particular in their work for the university overseas? So the kinds of examples that I'm thinking about is how junior staff often represent their university overseas, how they work with government sponsoring agencies to attract and admit students, how they work and support the development of TNE, or even, for example, getting university materials through customs. And I think, kind of, what's your view, or what's your answer to this? Or don't you think there's a risk or a problem of this kind of corruption?
Thank you, Enzo. Yeah, no, that is a good question, and I say that there is evidence of growing corruption. I should begin with a caveat. You know, fraud. Technically, fraud is not corruption. You know, in strict definitions, where fraud becomes corruption is when attempted frauds are what's the word, are disguised or hidden, or where people try to cover up, and then it becomes corruption. But like you, I mean, I've been working in universities, not at your level, but you know, more down amongst the weed for about 35 years, and I have very, very rarely come across the kind of examples of corruption that were being touted in some of those reports, which is, you know, the kind of the pilfering of money, or the kind of you know, that basically the examples that were given in some of those reports, they actually tried to do a kind of a profile of the fraudster, and it was one of the reports that was quite funny, came up with a really fine-tuned characterization of who the most likely fraudster was, and it was a male in their 50s, had all these personality traits of confidence, but more above all else, it said they had the opportunity. And that, I mean, I think you highlighted that as well, that the fact is that, you know, with the growing emphasis on the need for universities to bring in more different sources of revenue, the way in which, you know, big grants and so on have created project barons with their own, you know, their own sort of resources, their own ability to hire or dismiss staff. You know, this big funding model has created problems of sort of oversight and regulation and accountability. And I mean, there are other forms of corruption, and corruption in hiring practices, or corruption in favoritism and clientelism, and that is very much something that precarious staff really complain about. You know, you work for the Max Planck Institute as a postdoc, then you witness this kind of almost feudal type relationship. But in answer to your kind of question about, you know, isn't the bigger issue junior staff representing universities overseas? Probably, yeah. I mean, I think, you know, things have happened quite quickly, and you know, the money side most academics are not that good at handling that kind of financial responsibility, and the financialization of the university that has exposed many people on many different fronts. Sorry, I'm not sure if I.
No, I think that was really helpful. So, I mean, I think what you're suggesting is that there are issues, but perhaps what we've done as what leaders have done in universities. I no longer work in a university, or I'm no longer paid by a university. Is that we've missed the real issues by focusing on something else, being pushed to look at those issues by the accountancy firms, and we're missing what's really important and where the real risks lie across the institution. And it's not corruption. It's risks to staff. It's exposure of staff who are working for the university, thinking that they're doing what's best sometimes. Thank you.
Thanks, Enzo. Can we bring in Maria? Maria Ivancheva.
Yes. Hello, Cris.
Hi, Maria.
Hi. I was thinking, even when I saw corruption, it made me think about back in, I think it was 2017, when a bunch of people at the business school at the University of Leicester, who are now almost without exception being on the line for redundancies by management because they go their work critical. So just to kind of mention that bit, these were the critical management crowd, brought in specialists from Corporate Watch and together with a group of academics, we went through the public register to check for, is there something that we can spot about irregularities of how senior managers, for instance, at UK universities are performing in terms of ownership or membership within organizations that might be extra legal or something like this. And it was very funny because a few of us were from Bulgaria or Hungary, and we were all saying, like, guys, it just, in a way, in order to have something extra legal, you need almost to have a polity as Bulgaria, where there is a kind of legality that's imposed from the outside, and there are people that are doing something against it with the risk of being caught. Whereas in places with the so-called advanced systems of legality, like in democracy as the UK, corruption is legal. And that is a problem. There's nothing extra legal in anything that's being described. What our problem is who are we accountable to? And I've been thinking about the public interest. In whose interest is the fact that Russell Group universities sign contracts, monopoly contracts with online program management companies for 90% of the student fees revenue going directly into these private companies? Whereas most of the work, being done is still, from the university side. Whose interest, is the fact that, rating agencies are rating public universities as low risk so that they can take huge loans from investment banks in order to redevelop campuses. So these are all questions of, a huge redistribution from the public into private hands. And I think what you're describing, Cris, is just one other aspect of this. What Janja Kulmanovic is working on, the assetization of data of universities, is also part of it. It is all legal, that's the problem. And the second, the second kind of problem or question that I'll be posing is the question of, I'm sitting here thinking, Cris, aren't you afraid? At some point, any of these companies can come against you and say, there is libel, there is reputation damage by you implicating them in a talk about corruption. And I have been myself, in a much lower kind of scale within my own university, implicated in something like this, in which a private company said, having even one sentence in a big report that might be seen as in some way reputational damage, even if it was, probably a serious concern, would mean the private company goes against the university and the university has to defend its faculty, or what it did in that case, basically destroyed a lot of research data. So aren't we already at a place where we are, in a place where we're saying that we have academic freedom, completely deprived of that? And what is our way to protect ourselves? Because, thinking that KPMG might come after you is not a really nice imaginary, come think of it. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Maria. Well, you just sort of, I do sometimes fear and worry about all of us. It's the, we have whistleblowing charters and things like that, and we have concepts of academic freedom and free speech. And in New Zealand, that one of the part of the definition of the role of a university and its staff is to act as critic and conscience of society, and that was a choice phrase inserted in the legislation. But that does not protect you, as you say, against claims that you have damaged the reputation and good standing of an institution. I hope I haven't done that. I mean, I'm trying to be a bit more serious in what I'm doing. But yeah, certainly, I mean, my argument really echoes what you're saying completely, is that I'm trying to step back and analyze this as a process. And I see it in a much more macro shift in the way that, universities, higher education institutions they're really, they are rich sources of assets. And, we've seen in the 80s and the 90s how, for-profit private sector companies have sought to capture the assets of the utilities, the railways, the gas, electricity, and so forth. It's no surprise to see, the kind of the hovering of these interested groups sort of really kind of salivating at the prospects of unbundling the university and they're doing it in all sorts of little ways. You mentioned the massive building programs, the outsourcing of student halls of residence, conference facilities, the sports complex. And actually there it was, our own Office for Students former head, Sir Michael Barber, when he did his white paper, he talked about unbundling the university and reduced the public university to 10 core functions, and argued that many of these could be far better delivered if they were stripped out of, like rebundled in the hands of for-profit private providers. So yeah, what we're seeing here is what you say. You did also mention this thing about the corruption being legal in the UK. I think you're right in a way that the problem you've got is that the corruption is a very ambiguous term, and the definition really varies, and even fraud. When you look at the Australian, New Zealand, what do they call it? Governor General's kind of view of, not Governor General, serious fraud office. Even there, it's slightly murky in the interpretation, but in the UK, we've allowed many acts, things that in the past would have been unthinkable, have now become legal and appropriate. And, as you say, this transfer of assets is certainly over the past 2 decades has been deemed, right, proper and normal. And hiring cheap labor on programs, getting rid of them when the program has exhausted or completed its thing. I think that what you're talking about in the case of Leicester is just yet another illustration of what happens when you end up seeing university and all its functions through the prism and the lens of financialization. It just, it's the bottom line. These just aren't. This is just academic labor, units of resource that should be deployed in the most economic and efficient way. But yeah, the answer probably lies, again, the answer to Simon's question as well, that something really has to be done at the level of policy and legislation to get rid of this kind of quasi-legal protection, and to actually redefine, reclassify some of these acts as, I mean, if not illegal, but certainly not appropriate, bad practice, things that should not be allowed to happen.
Thanks, Maria, for your very thought-provoking question stroke statement, and thanks, Cris, for your thought-provoking reply. I mean, what always strikes me about the debundling or unbundling push is that it hasn't succeeded fully yet. And I think the elite research intensive universities that have such an enormous power in society now, and in relation to the sector as a whole, have got a primary interest in resisting the notion of debundling, because all of their operation depends on being able to sustain the joins between the different aspects, research and teaching, and the various services and constituencies and stakeholders they relate to. If they can hold the whole thing together, they have this this powerful social engine. If it gets debundled, they lose their role. The leadership is in other words, and the governing bodies have got a prima facie interest in preventing or blocking debundling. But you can't help feeling that with all of this enormous corporate pressure and political pressure from states that generally are more persuaded by the big four than they are by universities, that sooner or later something's going to break, something's going to happen. And we're going to see some sort of major and decisive change in the university as an organisation. But it has, digitalisation has been always seen as the Trojan horse, but it hasn't happened through digitalisation. And it isn't going to happen quickly through the pandemic. It isn't going to happen quickly. But if someone develops a prototype for teaching and learning, which really gets a lot of take up from students, then things start to change, I think. But at the moment, anyway, debundling is a storm that washes over us rather than breaks us up. And so there's a basis, therefore, for thinking there's a strong social organisation there, which can not only resist it in corporate terms, but can resist it democratically as well, and understands the implications of what you're saying. I better pass quickly now to Pierre Anders Forstorp, who's the next on our call list. Pierre.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Cris, for sharing this story from New Zealand. I'm calling you from Sweden here, also one of the countries that you mentioned that we pride ourselves on being very little corrupt. But I have a question about corruption in the academia, perhaps in another sense that you've been talking about, and I'll take the opportunity to hear your view on that. And you mentioned that briefly, namely the sort of the more mundane, everyday kind of corruption, sometimes labeled as collegiality. You mentioned the hiring practices and the clientelism and the cronyism, etc. More general, I'm quite inspired by the work by Alena Ledeneva on Russia and her notions of glut and systema and things like that. And I've been trying to apply that myself to the academic context with obvious differences, of course. But I'm just keen to know that if the narrative about corruption that you mentioned today would ever touch the more everyday practices of academic corruption, such as those I mentioned. If not, what's your take on them from your general perspective of an interest in academic corruption? Thank you.
We're in that murky world where you've got fine shades of grey and no clear definition. I mean, you remember the World Bank definition of corruption was always the abuse of public office for private gain, which is a ridiculously narrow definition because it confines corruption to the public sector. And then it was the more recent updated standard definition is, I think it's, what is it? Abuse of delegated authority in office. But it usually has in mind this idea that, that a corrupt individual is somebody who tries to pocket clandestinely, steal, rob their employer, and so on. But these other issues that you mentioned, clientelism, cronyism, the everyday hiring practices. I mean, that's the problem is that in many of the academic kind of cultures that most practice them, they don't consider that. That doesn't get classified as corruption. That's sort of in many places. That's the way it is. I used to, many years ago, I worked for a year teaching in an Italian university, and that was, that kind of hiring practice and workplace relations were very much clientelistic, and nobody blinked or batted an eyelid when you tried to challenge that. It was just, it was recognized that you belonged to somebody's sphere of influence, that the university was carved up by large professors who behaved and acted like barons and had all the entitlements of that. So that doesn't get, in answer to your question, I don't think that qualifies. What we were talking about more was about the kind of the financial corruption of the university. I would like to say though, just in answer to Simon, that the point that Simon raised about that the unbundling agenda so far hasn't worked, and that the big elite universities have pushed back because exactly they realize that what gives them their prestige and power is precisely the fact that they have bundled these functions. It's the weaker, smaller universities I worry about. And if COVID hadn't come along, we were looking at the last government white paper in the UK, what was it, 2017? It really envisaged, what do they call it? Market failure. It was trying to, I thought, when I read that document, I thought it was trying to prepare the ground to enable one or two institutions to go under so that they would be taken over by external, non-traditional for-profit providers, be it a consortium in Switzerland or some sort of, what is it, Phoenix, Arizona, or I think COVID and the current situation has meant that there aren't that many people waiting in the wings to swallow up and take over a failing UK institution. And there's also a lot of political backlash because the universities are now very often the largest employers in the towns in which they're located. Sorry, I hope I answered your question there, Per.
Thanks, Cris. And I think what we'll do is we'll take a bunch of questions because we're beginning to run out of time. I'll take a group of questions one after another and give you the omnibus right of reply to all of them. Generally, what I'm doing with this is running the questions up to about the hour, 3 o'clock UK time, and then giving you the reply. So you'll go 5 minutes or so after the hour. Now, the first question in that sequence then is C. Sanger. Mysterious C. Sanger, no Christian name. Come in, please.
Not mysterious, but not really a question either. So pass on.
Do feel free. You've got the call. Okay.
I don't think it's really a question, I'm afraid.
All right. David Mills, please. David.
Thanks, Cris. So I like the moral capitalism thing, and I think it's interesting that you can extract all sorts of value from universities even without unbundling them, thinking about Elsevier and its accusations that it seems to promote around predatory publishing, for example, so that you can find an enemy within by blaming corrupt academics for their bad publishing. But my question really was one around conspiracy theory, and clearly there is something going on here where they are, or at least we were surmising that there's a conspiracy that they're creating this moral panic around corruption. How do we evidence that? And bigger and more difficult challenge for us is, are we engaging in the same conspiracy theory that they're doing? What's the methodological problem there?
Hold your answer, Cris. Next is Hongwei Gu.
Thank you, Cris, for your righteous presentation. And I really enjoyed when you talk about aspects on the corruption and fraud. So my question is, with corruption rampant in universities today, what can our institutions do to bring about change in the way that the world media portrays this? Thank you.
And the next one is from Venkat. If you can come in, Venkat, and ask your question, please.
Hello.
There you are.
Thanks a lot for your presentation. It's really nice. My question is about if you have any comments on the corruption or the dishonest academic practices that are going on in the developing countries, because there seems to be quite rampant at different levels of higher education, at staff level, institutional level, and the governing body. So I just wanted to ask your opinion on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Venkat. So extending the argument then to the rest of the world. Morten Hansen, you're next. Morten.
Hi, Cris. Thank you for your presentation. Would it be helpful to think about profit margins when we think about the type of market making that KPMG is engaging in here? So thinking about it differently, is this a big business for KPMG, fraud hotlines? And if not, does that provide some insights in terms of what the actual market making is, like what's really going on here? Thank you.
Thanks, Morten. Fiona Ross.
Yeah, thank you very much. Interesting presentation. Thanks very much. I'm actually speaking. I'm a governor of Westminster University and also on the audit committee. So see in action the world that you're talking about. And I don't think that the audit culture in universities is going to go away anytime fast, because certainly in England, because of the increasing role of regulation. So, I mean, I just want to ask, what advice do you give to governing bodies about how they ensure oversight of the external audit, which is, I think, is what we're talking about here, and value for money, but also importantly, conflict of interest. And, you know, the heart of what we've been, the discussion today has been about conflict of interest, which I think is a perhaps a different way of thinking about corruption. I mean, corruption is quite a sort of a strong word, but there's often more insidious types of sort of conflict of interest that I would be worried about as a governor. So thank you.
Thanks, Fiona. Very thought-provoking. Our final questions from Lynn Ewan. Hello, Lynn.
Yes, thank you, Simon, and thank you, Cris, for the presentation. My question is that what do you think about the impact of the digital migration due to the COVID-19 pandemic on the university auditing culture? Because now a lot of activities and events from the university have to be online, and they leave their digital footprints with lots of data and metadata. So almost everything is traceable on the internet. So will that contribute to further reproducing the dominant roles of the Big Four? And will the ownership and access to digital data trigger a kind of academic neo-capitalism, and whether it may change the way that the Big Four do their auditing of the university? Thank you so much.
Well, Cris, there's quite a few points made there and questions asked, so it's over to you to respond.
I'll try and be brief. There was a hell of a lot of material, and I know I can't do justice to all these questions, also because I think some of them I'm actually quite out of my depth on this. But David, about the, you were asking me about the issue of the methodological one and about the evidence. Well, are we complicit, and is this a kind of conspiracy theory? It's looking for patterns, and I think the evidence was there. And it's when for me, the penny dropped when I started to see how these news feeds were being drip fed into the news, being picked up and kind of echo chamber. This wasn't even a case of sort of kind of social bots, but it was definitely a kind of it looked like a coordinated attempt to generate this concern about corruption, and doing your own supposedly independent report, KPMG doing a report on the state of the increase in fraud in New Zealand and then offering the services. There's a nice example, Fiona, for you about how we do need to separate. There is a clear conflict of interest. If they're the ones doing the report, providing the evidence, they shouldn't necessarily be the ones who are providing the solution and the cure, because they do have a vested interest in making the situation appear far more grim and dire than it is. The corruption, with the question about corruption being rampant, what can our institutions do to bring about changes? Again, I don't think that it's not that corruption isn't rampant. That's the whole point. I would de-escalate that fear. I think the issues were ones that Maria brought up, that it's more about certain legalized practices that really need rethinking, and what we are talking about in general, that the attempt to capture the assets that belong to or used to belong to public universities and to outsource, you know, we need to call a halt to outsourcing, privatization, and what in other contexts was called asset stripping. That's what my complaint should be. Venka, I'm sorry, I really couldn't hear what the question was. I haven't been able to, my microphone was very muffled there.
Chris, it's about, you know, corruption in the developing world, the emerging countries in the university sector.
Well, yeah, I mean, it has been said that, you know, after war, corruption is the greatest threat to many parts of the developing world, but also, I mean, who's it, Ossipian, who writes a hell of a lot about corruption in Russian and Ukrainian universities. Yeah. As well. It's not just a problem, but certainly there is a sense in which, you know, the very word corruption is sort of has a kind of Eurocentric hegemonic overtones, you know, because ways of doing things that require a little. It wasn't that long ago that you know, the United States overseas, you know, trade used to be sort of oil the wheels with a little bit of you know, kind of favoritism and some sort of sweeteners. You know, business deals were always sort of encouraged with sweeteners, and we know that those practices went on. So it would be a little bit hypocritical to condemn other developing countries for practices that are corrupt, when in many cases actually those so-called corrupt practices are the only way in which certain people can survive and put food on their table. So yeah, let's not be too ethnocentric about it and put it in its context. Morton, should we think about the profit margins? Is this big for KPMG? Probably not, but it's just, you know, these could be kind of lost leaders is the other way of thinking about it. You know, why are KPMG capturing, when you look at their sites, that the services that they now provide, it's huge. These companies, you know, between them employ over 1 million employees worldwide. Their profit margins, their surpluses are kind of higher than many small countries' gross domestic product. And it's just bit by bit. My own university is being audited in order to borrow a loan to secure the future of Goldsmiths University. The banks insisted that we had an independent auditor carry out a review to see whether we would be able to pay it back. Who's doing that review? KPMG. Why KPMG? Well, I don't know. You know, is this part of their, you know, business plan portfolio? It must be. I can only assume that they're investing in this area because it promises to deliver more and more in the future. And if you can capture this area, then, you know, all kind of businesses and organizations need to be, you know, corruption and anti-fraud initiatives are something that if you can encourage every organization to do it, then you're onto a winning market. Fiona, advice to governing bodies, and I agree with you. I think the key issue is about conflicts of interest. I mean, that's the most obvious one you have to avoid, and you've probably encountered that as well. I mean, I'm sure in you know, part of the strictures of being a member of the Audit and Finance Committee or being on that is to really to ensure and being quite scrupulous about that you're not treading, overstepping the marks or conflating roles. It's harder in smaller countries, you know, where particularly New Zealand, the joke is that it's 2 degrees of separation. Everyone knows somebody. And so, you know, and I imagine in small countries like Cyprus, or, you know, when you've only got 500,000 people, how do you create that social distance? Excuse the pun, I know we're all living in a world of social distance, but I mean that distance between key roles and processes, but maintaining that separation is really important for best practice. And finally, Lynn, the digitization, and has that reinforced audit? I guess so, as you say, you know, digitization has led to electronic footprints, and audit culture thrives in environments where you leave auditable trails. That's what it requires of, and that's part of what the auditification of our world is about. We have to become auditees and leave evidence trails so that the inspectors can see that we've got evidence of process. And everything being online is like this seminar now. I'm sure we're going to leave a long digital footprint, and I'm hoping Maria is not correct, and KPMG won't come after me now for defaming their reputation. But there is a permanent record of what I've just said here. You got me. That's it. And bang to rights. I'll stop there.
Cris, that was really great. I mean, the word corruption throws all kinds of, moral signals, doesn't it? And in some extent pushes us in different directions. And I suspect that has got in the way a tiny bit. But what's really chilling, I think, about your presentation today is that normal business is the problem, rather than its pathologies, if you like. That you have these large companies which use a quasi-monopoly position to create anxiety, which they then offer to they then provide a business service to solve, and they have themselves have contributed to the empirical underpinnings of that anxiety from time to time anyway. And so they're covering every possible business function here that they could, making money out of all of it. The corruption is in the moral order itself. It's in the moral order which enables large corporations to be seen as an end in themselves, and as having interests that override ordinary people, and universities being seen as an end in themselves, and rather than a means to very many other ends. And I think what you've done is you've thrown open that whole moral landscape of contemporary capitalism in the higher education sector, which Sheila and Larry Leslie, 1997 academic capitalism, started to make us think about. And that's a really important conversation, which Maria also contributes to regularly. And we will continue to maintain that conversation on this webinar series. So I hope we see you again. And thank you very, very much for your thought-provoking contribution today. And if you want to put it in a CG working paper, we'd be delighted to promote it from there. But thanks again, Cris, and thanks everyone for participating so well in the Q&A section. Our next webinar, which is next on Thursday, 2 days' time, is in Chile. And my old colleagues, Jose Salazar and Pete Leahy, are going to talk to us about Chilean higher education. And although I know them quite well, and they're totally outrageous and couldn't say almost anything, fortunately, they've got Elizabeth Sumberger with them to keep them sensible. And so we should have a very good webinar on Thursday. Look forward to seeing you all then. Bye for now.
Bye. Thank you.